As we begin this service, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're all waking up to so much that has happened in our country this past week and even in the last 24 hours. Um, you know, this past week, as we all know, there was just an unjust murder that happened in Minneapolis. We all saw the news coverage, and it's just a tragedy that took place. And it really shows and reveals more of the systemic injustice that exists in our country. And sometimes it's easy for us to kind of sit back and not. We have different levels. Some of us you feel enraged and you care so much. Some of us we might feel a little bit more passive. It feels like something over there. I was just thinking this morning, what helped me to kind of process these things, and I'm still learning as well. But a few years ago, when I was taking my Doctor of Ministry studies, I was studying in Philadelphia through my courses there, and the classmates, the cohort that I was part of, actually, the majority of my cohort were pastors from Philadelphia who were African American. And so it was a great learning experience for me, being an Asian American, and being with these African American pastors and going out to lunches with them and spending time with them. And like one of the things, if I can just give an example, one of the things that I learned through that time is that before that, in my mind, there's different issues, and we all land on different issues that we care about. And so, like, let's say the issue of abortion, for example. And in my mind at the time, I always thought to myself, the Bible seems to say that abortion would be something so wrong because you're taking the life of an unborn child. Isn't that murder? And so how could we support abortion? How could we vote for someone who supports abortion for president? And these African American pastors were actually giving me a lot of insight, saying, the issue that you're dealing with there is the sanctity of life. Life matters before God. And I agreed. Of course, that's what I was saying. But they were also saying, from their perspective, when you think about some of the injustices that exist in this world and in this life, it's also an issue of the sanctity of life, not just for the unborn child, but for the living person. If they're treated in a racially unfair way, if there's a system that does not treat them with equality, that's unjust, and that is not valuing their life. And so it really dawned on me during that conversation, and I'm still learning, but it helped for me to realize that it's not just about this issue, but there's such an array of issues over here as well that I had never really thought about concerning the sanctity of life. And so my point is, as we converse with others, we need to learn. And we need to put ourselves in the shoes of others that maybe we don't fully understand or we don't have their experiences, but they can help us to understand what they're going through if we're taking a posture of learning and humility. So as we see all the things happening around us, I really encourage us to really be thoughtful, be in a position and seat of learning, and really try to understand what people in our society and are going through that sometimes we may identify with, sometimes we don't identify with, but we need to learn and understand. And there's so much going on these days. And so I just want to encourage us just to have that posture of learning, and it helps us to see why things are happening and why people would make the choices that they do. It helps us to see the problems, the sin involved on both sides of everything. So just encourage us to think that way as we think through these things that are happening. And we need to be prayerful for our city. I'm so encouraged right now. I just looked out my window. There's lots of people on State Street on their hands and knees scrubbing the streets with sponges and soap and water. And I saw some people from our church as well. And so I'm so glad that they're out there serving in that way. And today's message is about service. And so let me ask you this question. What comes to your mind when I say the word service or the word serving? Perhaps you have a sense of privilege. I love to serve. Let me serve. I want to serve. Maybe that's a feeling that you have. Perhaps as you hear that word, it conjures up feelings of pain and difficulty. Maybe you had a bad serving experience or a bad serving situation before. Perhaps you just get tired thinking about the word. I don't want to serve. I'm tired of serving. I've served enough in my life. And you just want to be served. Maybe that's the feeling that you have. Well, whatever stage of life you are at, whatever life stage, we are always serving in different ways. We serve in our families, we serve in our churches, we serve in our companies, we serve in our communities, we serve in our neighborhoods. And I think the passage here today, as we are studying and continuing through Malachi, is this idea of serving. God is inviting us to be servants. He calls us to be His servants. And so we're going to continue our study through Malachi as we've been going through. We've talked about all these chapters. Here we are ending chapter 3. I'll have one more sermon on Malachi, and then we'll be done with Malachi. But we've talked about these chapters. In the beginning it was, God says, I have loved you. And the issue for Israel was apathy. They had apathetic hearts. God wanted to make sure that He is great among the nations, and He was talking about how they were bringing blemished sacrifices. He talked about covenant marriage and the problem of idolatry as they were loving false gods. He talked about where is the God of justice? Justice doesn't seem to prevail, and that was the issue. And then last week we talked about return to me, I will return to you, and the issue involved was tithing and offerings and giving of our hearts because of all that represents. So this morning, we're going to continue on as we finish up chapter 3. And today's theme is about serving. So 3 things we'll talk about regarding serving. First of all, regrets about serving. We have regrets sometimes. Secondly, relationships while serving. Relationships is really the basis of why we serve. And then finally, we'll talk about the reward for serving when we serve. So we'll talk about these 3 things: regret, relationships, and reward. So first of all, let's talk about regrets about serving. Look at verse 14. You have said, remember that disputational style, it is vain to serve God. What is the profit of our keeping His charge, or of waking as in mourning before the Lord of hosts? And now we call the arrogant blessed. Evildoers not only prosper, but they put God to the test and they escape. And so you get this sense here that the people of Israel are regretful about their serving. And I thought to myself, why is it that they might be regretful about serving? Why is it that we are sometimes regretful about serving? I thought of a few reasons. I think one reason is fatigue. When you think about Israel, they had an incredibly long history, hundreds of years of serving God. They went through 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They went through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. They were conquered by the Assyrians, conquered by the Babylonians, and so much more. And as a nation, they've gone through ups and downs serving God. And it just is tiring. They're fatigued. Sometimes as we serve God, we face the same feelings of fatigue too, don't we? We can be fatigued after serving year after year in the same kind of ministry, the same family group, the same ministry team, the same family situations, the same things at work, and we get fatigued. Verse 14 says that they are walking as in mourning. That's not very happy sounding. It sounds like their heads are down. There is no joy in serving anymore. They are walking in mourning. Walking like zombies as they serve because there's no joy. We can be fatigued as we serve God in our families. A friend of mine, his father is going through major illness and going to the hospital and nursing home, and there's fatigue in taking care of his parents. We can feel fatigued after trying to do the right thing and trying to love others. Maybe they're unlovable and they're rejecting you and they're hurting you and you're trying to love them, but it's tiring and you feel fatigued. I think these Israelites are tired, exhausted, fatigued to the point where they say it is vain to serve God in verse 14. It's vain, it's vanity to serve God. Is it worth it? And fatigue like this after a while makes us regret serving God. I think not only that, there's frustration. serving can be frustrating. As we look in verse 15, it describes the arrogant ones in this world. They seem to be the ones that are blessed. The arrogant ones, why are they getting blessed? We're trying to be humble. We're trying to serve God, but we're not the ones that look like we're more blessed by God. And it goes on to describe how evildoers not only prosper, but it seems like God lets them get away with stuff, get away with their evil acts. What's up with that? In other words, you know that feeling of frustration when it seems like injustice prevails over justice? You are fighting for the right thing. You're wanting the right thing. You're wanting justice, but injustice seems to prevail. In the end, when those who do evil, when those who are racist, when those who hurt others seem to get away with it, it sometimes seems like God turns a blind eye in this world. And we can feel frustrated. I think these Israelites were feeling that frustration. Remember a couple of weeks ago, where's the God of justice? We can feel that frustration as we serve and invest into the life of someone else and they turn their back on you. Serving can sometimes feel like one-way love as you give and give and give, but you're never returned anything. There can be frustration that makes us regret serving God. I think a third reason why this sometimes happens and we feel regret is failure. I think about these Israelites. They're feeling low right now, but as we think about history, just a few decades ago, they were at highs. They had rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. They had rebuilt the walls with Ezra and Nehemiah. But now a few decades pass, and then they went from high to low spiritually, and they went from revival up here on the mountaintops. Now they're in the valley low spiritually. And even though there was a time of success, now it seems like a time of dismal failure as their hearts have drifted away from God and the recent revival has faded away. Sometimes we can have Sunday highs and Monday lows. Sometimes we have retreat highs and then springtime lows. We might look back at the spiritual successes when we went on a mission trip, when we experienced revival, when we felt used by God as we served before, but now we find ourselves, our hearts are not really on fire. And instead there's a sense of failure as we look inside deep within. That feeling of failure. Was it all worth it? Did I do anything? Did it matter? That feeling of failure can sometimes make us regret serving God. Why did I put so much time during my college years? Now in my young adult years, I'm just struggling spiritually. Was that all worth it? Was it a failure? And we regret serving God like that. Perhaps there are some of you this morning who have that same kind of feeling of regret when you think about serving in the past. Maybe you remember feeling so tired, fatigued. Maybe it was so frustrating trying to love people, getting hurt, disappointed in the end. Maybe you did all that you could but saw no fruit and you just feel like, man, I just failed. It wasn't worth it. And you have feelings of regret. We all have those times. But I think the hope in this passage and what God wants to do and intervene here is He wants to raise their mourning faith. They're in a state of mourning, but He wants to raise up their head so they see Him and they look at Him. So first, we saw the reasons for which they might have regret serving. But secondly, we see the importance of relationships while serving. Relationships while serving. Look at verse 16. It says, then, there's a transition here. Different kind of perspective coming out here. Then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another. They're talking. They're discussing. The Lord paid attention. This is awesome. The Lord paid attention and heard them. He's got an ear to whatever's going on there. And then a book of remembrance was written before Him of those who feared the Lord and esteemed His name. And then He says, they shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my treasured possession. and I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. This is a beautiful passage here. Now notice the idea of relationships here. In my point, I say relationships while serving. It's plural. It's not just relationship, but it's plural. Because I believe this passage shows us not only our vertical relationship with God, which is essential, but I think just as essential is the importance of our horizontal relationship with others, especially during these times when we feel regret. Verse 16 here says, the ones who feared the Lord, what did they do? Yes, they fear the Lord vertically, but what do? They speak with one another horizontally. What are they doing? I'm sure there were some that probably felt like complaining to God when they looked at their circumstances, when they looked at their regrets. I'm sure some of them wanted to quit. I'm sure some of them felt fatigued and tired. But as they spoke to one another, what are they doing? They're helping each other. They're saying, hey, look at God. Hey, don't look at ourselves. Don't look at our feet. But let's look at God. Stop the mourning and let's start worshiping. And they're helping each other turn their focus to trust in and to have faith in their covenant God once again. That's true fellowship. That's why we need to gather. That's why we need to have times when we speak to one another. So a question to ask ourselves is, what kind of voice are you right now to others? When others come with their regrets, when others come with their complaining, when others come with their frustrations, are you someone who turns their anger and their regret and their complaining upwards towards God? Are you someone that helps them to magnify those negative feelings? We need to be like these people who feared the Lord and they spoke to one another. Maybe they spoke psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to one another so that they would turn their focus towards God. That's what a family group ought to do. That's what friends in Christ ought to do. So now, because of that horizontal accountability and camaraderie, now that helps them to turn vertically to God. We need friends like this. We need relationships like this. Now, I believe as we look at this, they have three reasons why, because of relationships, they can keep on serving God now in this vertical relationship. So three things. We serve God, they would now say, because they had that camaraderie that turned their focus upwards and vertically. They would say, now we serve God in this relationship. We serve the God who remembers us. Again, it seemed like there were maybe two camps of thinking when it came to serving God. Some of the Israelites hear God's rebuke, they continue feeling a regret, but others respond differently, as we see here in verse 16. They fear the Lord, they speak to one another, and they help, admonish, encourage, and lift one another up to fear Him and to live for Him. Now, I love this here in verse 16. It goes on to say that the Lord paid attention. He heard them. And He recorded their names in a book of remembrance. I think this is so important and encouraging. Sometimes we feel like when we're serving, when we're meeting with others about serving, when we're going through things with other people, sometimes we feel like I'm doing all these things and no one knows, no one notices, no one acknowledges, I'm doing it all alone. But when we serve with our hearts, I think this tells us that God always sees and God always remembers us. No one else may notice, but we should remember that it's God who always remembers us. There are some of you here who maybe you've been serving, and maybe you do feel exhausted, and maybe you feel discouraged, and you feel like you're in it alone. But can I encourage you, as you look at God, know that we serve God who remembers us. He sees us. He sees what you do. He sees your heart. He remembers us. I think that encourages us to keep on serving. I think a second thing, as we look vertically, these people see that we serve God who treasures us. Verse 17 says, "They shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my treasured possession. Now this phrase, treasured possession, when these Israelites hear those words, this has deep meaning for them. Because when you look back to Genesis and the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when you look at Exodus, God said, my people are my treasured possession. And so what these Israelites would hear and remember from the stories that their parents told them is that God's covenantal relationship with us is one where we are His people set apart. We are His treasured possession that He will never let go of. It's like a child who has a toy or a stuffed animal that they love and they care about, that they sleep with, that they'll never let go. It's their treasured possession. They always know where it is. They always care about it. They're always carrying it. God is the same way with us. We are His treasured possession. We have a love relationship with God where He will never let us go, where His covenant love is set upon us. He cares for us deeply. We are His treasures. And so when we think about our serving God, we don't do it like slaves. We don't do it like servants. We don't do it like hired hands. We do it because of a love relationship that we have with our covenantal God who gives His life for us. He will one day gather us and take us home as His bride. We are His treasured possession. And so it motivates us in serving God because of this relationship. Finally, one other way that we see this relationship play out, we serve God who adopts us. Verse 17 continues to say, and I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. Now, this is intimate family language being used by God, and He's describing the idea of sonship. Now, to be a son in the Old Testament times was great privilege. You know, like if you were a son, like first son of a family, you were automatically the sole inheritor of everything that your father had. You know, like nowadays, you know, like when I pass away, whatever I have, you know, it'll go 50-50 to my son and my daughter, 50%, 50%. But in the Bible times, if you are the first son, you get 100%. Even if you have 10 other siblings, you'll get 100%. So this idea of sonship is very powerful and very important. So what this is saying is that a father's love for a son is one where he treasures his son, he loves his son, he cherishes his son. Even if his son messes up and makes mistakes, that father would want to spare his son because that father has his son as an heir of everything that he has. In the same way, God considers His people with that sense of sonship. He's going to give us everything. He's not holding anything back, but we are recipients of all that He has for us. Now, you think about what's going on here. It would be natural for a father to spare their own son, even a son that rebels, a son that deserves punishment. A father wants to spare their son. But now if you think about this, what this is alluding to is that Israel is the disobedient son. God is going to spare Israel. Even though Israel doesn't deserve it, God is going to spare Israel like a son. But how is He going to do that? He is going to spare Israel as a son by not sparing His own son, Christ, who will come on the cross. Christ will not be spared so that Israel can be spared. This is that relationship of sonship that we have with God. This is the relationship that motivates us to want to keep on serving. So our serving is not one where we have to, where we're prodded with a stick or something. Our relationship is one that motivates us to serve Him because He remembers us, because we are treasured by Him, because He adopts us as His sons. So first, we saw the negative. We saw regrets in serving. We all have them. I have them too. We have those regrets. But we need to turn our focus away from ourselves. We need to turn our focus towards Him and be reminded of why it is that we are called to serve, why it is that we're invited to serve. It's because of these relationships, and our relationships with others remind us of our relationship with God. And then finally, we'll see the reward for serving. Look at verse 18. Then once more you shall see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between the one who serves God and the one who does not serve Him. I think there's two aspects to this. First of all, I think about future judgment. Verse 18 gives future tense, you shall see. So it's future, describing a day that is coming soon. Now it says here that in the future there's going to be a distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, a couple of weeks ago we described how Malachi is a prophet and he's looking towards the future. And we know in retrospect that there's a first coming of Jesus and there's a second coming of Jesus, and we can distinguish between the two. But I believe when Malachi is a prophet, he's looking forward to the future. I believe he doesn't distinguish because he just sees what's coming in one view like this. We look back and we look forward, but Malachi sees everything in front of him, and so he really lumps much of it together without distinguishing. So I believe what this is talking about, this distinction that takes place, is that second coming of Jesus, when Jesus comes as a judge. The Bible tells us that when Jesus comes as a judge, He comes like a lion. He comes as one who will separate the sheep and the goats. So Jesus is coming in that second time to be a judge. Now let me point out something that's helpful here. Notice that as He describes this distinction between the righteous and the wicked in that second coming, He then connects it in the same sentence. Next words, He says, the one who serves God and the one who does not serve Him. So, in other words, it seems to imply that the righteous serve God and the wicked do not serve Him. So initially when I was studying this, I thought it seems obvious that He considers the fact that both the righteous, it seems strange that the word serving is used in both the righteous and the wicked, because I would think the righteous are serving God and the wicked are not serving. But in actuality, it says that both the righteous and the wicked are serving, but the distinction, the difference is that the righteous are serving God. In other words, I think what this is saying is that God makes a distinction. God sees a distinction that sometimes we cannot see about ourselves or even other people. In other words, two people might be serving, but it's God who knows what's really in their hearts, whether they are serving Him or whether they are serving themselves. I think about this example when I was a youth pastor in Philadelphia. I remember after the service, it was the job of the youth group to clean up the fellowship hall, put away all the chairs and tables, mop the floor. And I remember that my youth group kids, very small youth group at the time, so many of them had to go with their parents, disperse, so that job really fell on me sometimes. And there's elders in the church and other people, adults in the place, so I'm doing that job, cleaning up the tables, putting away the chairs, mopping the floor. And I remember one day, I'm mopping the floor, and I'm doing it as slowly as possible. Why? Because I wanted to make sure that all the elders and all the adults in that church, they would walk by at some point, the fellowship hall, and they would see me so faithfully serving. I wanted to make sure that they would know that I'm doing all that. Why? Because in my heart at the time, I wasn't serving God so much as serving myself. Because I wanted to be respected by them. I wanted to be noticed by them. I wanted to be acknowledged by them. In many ways, my motive was more about serving myself more than serving God. I think what this is saying is that God not only sees our outward serving, But God sees why we serve. God sees our hearts. Two people can be leading worship. Two people can be putting away chairs. Two people can be serving food. Two people can be doing things for their family. But God not only sees what we do, but God sees why we do it. He sees a distinction. I think we need to really think about that. We need to be careful that as we serve and as we do things, that we are not merely being religious and doing it outwardly, but we are doing it because of a relationship that we have with God. And we're doing it from our hearts. In the end, we might be surprised because there are some people who serve God for themselves, who serve, but really serve for themselves. It looks like it's serving God, but it's really for themselves. And in the end, God will make that distinction. We might be surprised at which side of that distinction that people fall upon. So we need to examine ourselves. Am I doing it for the Lord as much as possible? It's never 100%, but as much as possible. Am I doing it for the Lord, or am I doing the same thing? Am I doing it for myself? God is not interested in what we do, but why we do the things that we do when we serve. I think just one other quick aspect of this passage that I want to add is this idea of future reward. In this verse in Matthew 25:23, if we were to turn to there, there's this picture of what would happen when we someday stand before Jesus in heaven after that distinction takes place. And on that day, what will happen is he will say to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And on that day, when he says that to us, we will be rewarded with a heavenly rest that is eternal. An eternal celebration. No more tears, no more fears, no more pain, no more injustice. We will be rewarded with the fullness of his presence for all eternity. There will be no more sin in our hearts. We'll feel like serving him was so worth it on that day. No matter how much you served, no matter how much you sacrificed, no matter how much you did and gave up, it will feel like it was so worth it. And on that day, we will wish we had served him even more faithfully, even more wholeheartedly. We will wish we had served him all the more when we hear his words saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Come, enter into your rest." I hope and pray that all of us would long for, would desire to hear those words someday. "Well done, good and faithful servant." It will be so worth it. It will be so worth it. And so as we think about this idea of serving in this passage, we talked about three things. We talked about, sometimes we have regrets. If you feel like that right now, it's okay. I feel like that sometimes, but it's not okay to stay there. And so what we need to do is we need to speak with one another and hear the right voices that don't just say, "Keep regretting," but the right voices that say, "Remember your relationship with God." We need those relationships in our life and those voices that turn us to look at God once again. And then we realize why we serve, that relationship. And then finally, we look forward to one day, that reward, when he will say to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Well done, good and faithful servant. And I can't wait for that day. I hope I hear those words because I know that whatever we do in this life, whether people see or don't see, God sees it. God remembers. We will be rewarded, and it will be so worth it. This morning, as I came here this morning earlier, I was so blessed and humbled. As we know, much tragedy has taken place and injustice and all these things. And last night there was protests and demonstrations, and then there were some people who who definitely took it too far with looting and vandalism. And actually, right in front of our church building here in Fontana Sports downstairs, graffiti is on the wall and on the sidewalks. And I was really blessed this morning. At around 6 a.m., I looked out my window, and there were just like hundreds of people all carrying a broom, face mask, garbage bags, dustpans. Thousands of people, hundreds of people, at least 1,000 people were out here. And I just remember just being so overwhelmed. I just couldn't stop watching as people were out there. And then I saw people were downstairs, so I went down there and I talked with some of them, opened up, unlocked all the doors so that they could use the bathrooms, have access to water, because they were cleaning the graffiti off of our church building. And I thought, man, I talked to a few of them and I said, are you guys part of an organization or something? And they all said that they just saw a notice on Facebook last night. And individually, they're all individuals, random individuals who just responded and who decided to come out to serve their city. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. They're not paid for this. They're not part of some group. But they're just individuals who said, I want to serve my city. What a blessing that is. And many of them might not even be believers, but I think we can learn so much from them. Sometimes as Christians, we can talk about serving. Sometimes we talk big about serving. But rather than standing by, I hope and pray that we would have a mindset of, as God's people, as children of God, as His treasured possession, as sons of God, we would be servants in this world so that the world could see not just our acts of service, but so that we can picture the one who came to serve, the one who came to give His life as a ransom for many by serving us, by dying for us on the cross. I think the world needs to see a church filled with people who serve on their hands and feet, filled with people who humble themselves, serving, so that they would see the true servant who is Jesus Christ. May we start even in the smallest ways by being servants to those around us. Let's pray together.